Caitlin Chess is an author, an emerging theologian who is a PhD student at Duke University, and she's a podcaster. That's how I know her. If you're like, well, wait, what's a podcaster, Pastor? It's like talk radio, but instead of a radio, it's through your cell phone, right? Caitlin Chess is a podcaster, and her podcast with two others is called the Holy Post Podcast. And she talks about her life and experiences in addition to reflecting on theology and life today. And one of the things she talks about periodically is her time in debate, where she competed in debate when she was in college, right? She competed in debate. And she found it to be, generally speaking, a blessed experience, especially the amount of time she had to pour into understanding other people's arguments. She said that would help her understand other people's perspectives, whether she agreed with them or not. But she also said that the practice of, accumulating facts and asserting values and things of that nature, and using them not as a way of trying to build community together, but as weapons, right? In this debate contest. She was fine with that, of course, in the context of everyone knows this is a debate contest. But she worries that too many people take those habits and practices of reflecting on and articulating core values, of becoming knowledgeable about facts and arguments and truth statements and all of that, and that instead of using that to build a better world, that people strategically deploy values and truth statements as weapons to win. She's not the first person to ever consider this as problematic. In the 5th century BC, 400 to 500 years before Jesus was even born, there was a group of Greek educators called the Sophists. It's where we get the term sophistry from. And they would go around the different city-states, and people would pay them money to teach their kids how to argue. And again, there was a lot of benefit to this. Essentially, you were teaching your kids about a wide range of subjects and places and all of these things. It was a good way to get your kids educated. But even then, 2,500 years ago, philosophers would wonder, is it really good to learn all of these things just to employ them as weapons to win? You see, brothers and sisters, in today's reading, Pilate and the chief priests are engaging in sophistry. They are articulating values and alleged facts, not to try to seek truth or to build a better world, but to win. To destroy, in this case, Jesus, to maintain or enlarge power. And while all of this is happening, while this sophistry is happening around him, Jesus remains steadfast. Jesus remains steadfast as our rejected but nonetheless real King, who we as Jesus followers called to follow, even when it takes us to the cross. And so in today's reading, it picks up a little bit, not immediately, but a little bit after last week's reading. Between last week's reading and this week's reading, we saw Barabbas being introduced as the insurrectionist, who then the people wanted Pilate to release Barabbas, an actual insurrectionist who was part of a group who were actually trying to overtake Rome. People wanted Pilate to release him instead of Jesus, who was accused of being an insurrectionist who wanted to take over Rome. So that happened in between last week's and this week's reading. And so Pilate, knowing that Jesus is innocent, that's one thing we learned last week. Pilate already knows, and Pilate has declared that Jesus is innocent. But to satisfy the crowds, he has Jesus flogged. And as Ms. Jessica pointed out, I appreciate her leaving these up here. I don't normally use props. But they twisted thorns. A bit smaller. I don't think Jesus' head was this big, though I don't know that. They placed this on his head. And then they got a purple robe, which was a color for royalty. They put that on him. And they did actually, this was a common thing that Roman soldiers would do with prisoners, especially prisoners who might or who would be crucified. They'd make a spectacle of it. They'd make a theatrical performance out of it. And so they're doing that here. They put the crown of thorns on him, they put the robe over him, and they mock him, and Pilate allows this, knowing that Jesus is an innocent figure. He'll let the soldiers have their fun, he'll satisfy the crowds. And then when Jesus gets back from that, Pilate hears finally an accusation, a solid accusation, that Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Which was, there are two levels to that. One, that's a spiritual claim, a claim of divinity. But also it was really common at that time. It was common in Rome, it was common elsewhere for kings to claim that they were divine, that they were sons that they were sons of God. In fact, we see here in Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 12, that through the prophet Isaiah, God is condemning a king for essentially doing this. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, I will raise my throne above the stars of God. And then it goes on to say, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. In Rome, many of the emperors, many who took the name Caesar, also claimed this title as Son of God. And so Pilate brings Jesus back and says, where are you from? It's not clear whether Pilate is asking a spiritual question or whether Pilate is like, hey, we've got some people on our Rome's most wanted list. Which one are you? Right? Which one of these people who claims to be the king of Israel are you? And then with Jesus' answer, and then Jesus saying that the one who handed him over would have the greater sin. Pilate, once again, believes that Jesus is innocent. But once again, doesn't seem to care that much. He seems to interpret this phrase that Jesus says about someone else having the greater sin as some kind of free pass that he doesn't have any responsibility. You must not have heard when Jesus said in Luke chapter 12, verse 48, that from the one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded. That's often interpreted as, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so there's Pilate, who kind of just goes along, and eventually he agrees to the crucifixion, which again is startling, because he knows Jesus is innocent. But he agrees to the crucifixion because these Jewish leaders have made an important concession to him. These Jewish leaders who initially didn't even have a charge to bring against Jesus. They were like, well, of course he's guilty. Wouldn't we bring him to you if he wasn't? And eventually bring this charge that they knew served two purposes. They knew that accusing Jesus of being the Son of God, like I've said, was an accusation of insurrection, of rebellion, of claiming a royal title. But for their Lord, it was blasphemy. And Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16, in the Old Testament, said that the punishment for blasphemy is death. And so they want Jesus dead. And they're willing to change their argument, to do whatever it takes and say whatever it takes to make sure that that happens. And so the last verse of today's reading is probably the most stunning. We have no king but the emperor, also translated, we have no king but Caesar. It's stunning because one of the core beliefs of Jews throughout their history, and especially during Jesus' time, is that there was no king but God. In fact, you might think, well, Pastor, clearly you haven't read the Old Testament. See, there's King Saul, and there's King David, and there's his son, King Solomon. Yes, I know all of that. But God only allowed the Israelites to have a king because they begged for one. And in doing so, God actually said, in begging for a king, you are committing sin. Because you are rejecting God as your king. That was in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4 to 9, when the prophet Samuel was told by the people that they wanted a king. And so for them, these chief priests, these people who are tasked with leading the people of God, for them to be willing to declare at that time, there is no king but Caesar. There is no king but the emperor. Even though the faith that they proclaim says there is no true king but God. That is sophistry. That is taking values and truth statements and facts and using them as weapons rather than discerning God's truth and God's will. And so Pilate, with this concession, with this public affirmation of the power of Rome, allows them to kill an innocent man. And all the while there is Jesus. remaining steadfast, often silent. And when he wasn't silent, he was brief. In many ways, the description of Jesus here is what some in Rome at the time would have considered the pinnacle of manliness or masculinity. Which is a little odd, because you think of masculinity as like winning, right? We think of winning and dominating and those kinds of things. But in Roman culture, they would have seen what Jesus was doing. The strength he held, the courage he had to persist in the face of certain death. That would have been inspired. That would have been a model for masculinity, for manliness at that time. Jesus doesn't try to argue. Jesus doesn't try to win an argument. He reveals God's truth through his words and his actions. And despite the soldiers' mockery, despite them certainly not believing that he was a king of any kind, we proclaim Jesus as king. As it says in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 9, that after he suffered death on the cross, therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name. So the name of Jesus every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Brothers and sisters, we are here because we proclaim Jesus as Lord. And if we proclaim Jesus as Lord, if we understand Jesus to be our true King, that we don't make that claim just to try to feel superior over others or to win arguments or anything of that nature, but we make that claim because we believe it. Then, brothers and sisters, let's actually follow Jesus as his subjects. As subjects of a king would follow their king, even if it meant going to certain death. For Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, if any want to become my followers, then let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. Brothers and sisters, as we approach Palm Sunday and Good Friday and Easter, may we remember that even though Jesus is rejected, he is still our King. And we are to follow him, even and especially on the way to the cross and beyond. Amen.